I'm Peter Adamson, and you're listening to the History of Philosophy podcast, brought to you with the support of the Philosophy Department at King's College London and the LMU in Munich. Online at historyofphilosophy.net. Today's episode, Friends of the Truth, Arnauld and Jansenism. Hands up, who remembers Thomas Bradwardine? He was an archbishop we covered when looking at medieval philosophy. If you do remember him, it will probably be because his name kept coming up in the context of various debates of the 14th century. He anticipated later teachings on grace by insisting on God's predestination, produced innovative writings about logic, including a solution to the liar's paradox, and even got a mention in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Today's subject, Antoine Arnauld, has put me in mind of Bradwardine, because like him, Arnauld is not terribly famous, yet seems to be pervasive in the philosophical literature of his time. Like Bradwardine, he wrote on both philosophy and theology, making important contributions in logic under the former heading, and in his theological writings developing a position on grace that Bradwardine might have found sympathetic. He was also a man of the church, though he did not rise within the hierarchy as high as Bradwardine did. To the contrary, he became the intellectual leader of a movement that was fiercely opposed by the mainstream French church, Jansenism. As you can tell, Jansenism is not named after Arnauld. Even French isn't that strange. Its namesake was Cornelius Jansen, a Dutch bishop who caused a stir in France with a mammoth theological treatise tellingly called Augustinus. Jansenism took its inspiration above all from St. Augustine and insisted on a rigorous teaching of divine grace. Their main rivals were the Jesuits, to the point that one 17th century cardinal defined Jansenists as Catholics who don't like Jesuits. Among the Jesuits, grace and predestination were usually understood to work in the way proposed by Luis de Molina toward the end of the 16th century. For the Molinists, God has foreknowledge of how humans will choose, while also knowing that other choices would have been possible. He can tell in advance which possibility we will freely choose, and generously bestows grace to help those who will choose to be righteous. For Jansen, this came too close to the Pelagian position already condemned by Augustine in late antiquity. It would suggest that, in some sense, it does lie within our power to merit salvation. As Jansen acidly remarks in the Augustinus, the Jesuit account amounts to saying that Christ died for nothing and is called Savior for no particular reason. Instead, Jansen and his followers emphasized the sufficiency of what they called efficacious grace, which is freely given by God and guaranteed that the person who has received it will act righteously. Arnauld's affiliation to this movement was itself all but predestined. His father, also named Antoine Arnauld, had a generation earlier polemicized against the Jesuits, going so far as to argue that the order should be expelled from France. His children took up the cause. Two daughters, Angélique and Agnes, were leading figures of the abbey at Port-Royal, which from now on I'm just going to call Port Royal, as if it were in English. Here, they cultivated a rigorously ascetic and profoundly spiritual culture. Angélique emphasized the inwardness of this spirituality, writing, "It is by the interior that the exterior must be formed, not by the exterior to make the interior." Along the same lines, Agnes affirmed that silent as well as spoken prayer was practiced at Port Royal, which is another point you might remember, since it was a matter of controversy in counter-Reformation Spain. According to Agnes, the nuns at Port Royal were not so prideful as to think they had become perfect, but that was nonetheless their aim. Such protestations of humility notwithstanding, an archbishop who visited Port Royal said the nuns there were pure as angels, but proud as devils. Their longer-term reputation has been similar. The Jansenists have gone down in history not as friends of the truth, which is how they styled themselves, but as synonymous with rigorism, joylessness, and severity in religion, in the words of the editors of a recent anthology of Jansenist texts. One might ask oneself, with Catholics like this, who needs Calvinists? The Jansenist teaching on grace looks suspiciously close to that of the Protestants, and Jansenism has even been described as a reformation that failed. Yet all the leading Jansenists, including Arnauld and Pascal, emphatically rejected Protestantism. Pascal made the point in his inimitable fashion, saying to the Jesuits, "The Jansenists resemble the heretics in the reformation of their behavior, but you resemble them in evil." They stayed within the Catholic Church primarily for theological reasons, since they were committed to the need for a priesthood to administer the sacraments. They were certainly not motivated by any affection for the scholastic theology still dominant within the Catholic hierarchy. To the contrary, Jansen himself was highly dubious of scholastic thought, which he considered to be undermined by its dependence on pagan philosophy. Aristotle and the other Greeks had exalted human nature and considered it possible to perfect that nature through freely chosen effort. A vital correction to this had been provided by Augustine, who refuted the pagan celebration of pure nature with his teachings about grace and original sin. Pascal expresses this outlook in many passages of his Pensées. For example, "Humans, it is hopeless to look for the remedy for your wretchedness in yourselves. All your intelligence can only bring you to realize that it is not in yourselves that you will find either truth or good." According to the Jansenists, scholastic thinkers like Molina and other Jesuits failed to appreciate the Augustinian critique fully. They continued to use natural reason when trying to plumb the depths of Christian theology, and as a result exaggerated the contribution of humans to their own salvation. As Jansen put it, philosophy accommodated divine grace to the tyrannical commands of human freedom. Since the truths of religion are in fact beyond human reckoning, we must find them in Scripture and in the authoritative writings of the Church Fathers, basing ourselves on transmitted tradition rather than our own minds. Jansen thus wrote, "Just as the intellect is the proper faculty to undertake the study of philosophy, remembrance is the proper faculty to undertake the study of theology." Arnauld agreed, repeatedly quoting a line from Augustine, "What we know, we owe to reason, what we believe, to authority." He wound up paying the price for those beliefs. At the behest of another early Jansenist leader, the abbot of Saint-Cyran, Arnauld wrote an apology for Jansen. Here, he explained the ideas of the Augustinus in French for the first time, broadcasting them to a wider audience. In 1563, Jansen was condemned for teaching 5 unacceptable propositions, with the key issue being his teaching on grace. The Jansenists responded by saying that the 5 offending propositions were not to be found anywhere in Jansen's writings. So now, arguments raged over what Jansen had even said, never mind whether his teachings were true. Arnauld was right at the center of all this. He and his colleague, Pierre Nicole, contributed a typically nuanced distinction to the debate. There was on the one hand the question of what Jansen had in fact written, on the other hand the question whether his intended teaching was right. Arnauld argued that the Pope was within his rights as a religious authority to pronounce on what is right, but not on matters of fact. Which sounds reasonable enough, but the implications were unnerving, at least for the Church. After all, any judgment the papacy might make would always involve some questions of fact. If the Pope has no authority to decide those questions, then none of his judgments can apply to any concrete situation. He would be like a judge who can say that murder is wrong, but never say whether a certain person has committed murder. Thus Arnauld was, intentionally or not, undermining the whole basis of papal authority. As a result, he was stripped of his doctorate and expelled by the Paris theology faculty, or Sorbonne, in 1656. As if that weren't enough, all the theologians who had voted in his favor were also expelled. It was this that drew Pascal into the fray. His provincial letters used his considerable rhetorical skills to defend Arnauld, attack the Sorbonne, and for good measure heap scorn on the Jesuits. One Jesuit described Pascal's letters in a way that makes clear their effectiveness as well as his own outrage. "There are subtle jokes to divert fine minds, useful ones to interest rich people, low ones to amuse valets and servant girls, impious ones to satisfy libertines, and sacrilegious ones to have sorcerers dancing at their Sabbath." Ultimately, though, the eloquence of Pascal and the hair-splitting distinctions of Arnauld were in vain. King Louis XIV proved to be a determined opponent of the Jansenists. He moved against Port Royal in 1679, dispersing its members and closing its schools, though the abbey was allowed to struggle on in diminished form until 1709. Arnauld fled to the Netherlands and spent the rest of his life there, dying in 1694. So, that's Antoine Arnauld, religious reformer and controversialist. But there was also Antoine Arnauld, Cartesian philosopher. This Arnauld was also quite a controversialist. Most famously, he was one of the men asked to write objections to Descartes' Meditations, in which context he first raised the problem of the Cartesian circle. He also disputed with other philosophers in writing, including Malebranche and Leibniz. It's natural to ask what connects the two versions of Arnauld, and more generally, what connects Cartesian philosophy to the Jansenist religious movement. Even in his objections to the Meditations, it's recognizable that we are dealing with the same man. Steeped as he was in Augustinian thought, He was just as quick as Mersenne to note the parallel between Descartes' cogito and an anti-skeptical argument found in Augustine. He also worried that Descartes' skeptical strategy could cause offense to theologians, since calling absolutely everything into question would involve doubting things we are meant to believe by faith. Perhaps then the truths of Christianity should be excluded from the method of doubt? Descartes readily agreed to this suggestion in his replies, probably just so that the issue could then be safely ignored. As Descartes himself admitted, "I keep away as far as possible from questions of theology." Which makes it puzzling that, as one 17th century Protestant remarked, the theologians of Port Royal are as devoted to Cartesianism as they are to Christianity. The two were so closely linked that when Cartesian philosophy was repressed in the 1670s, it may have been in part because of its links to Jansenism. What then was the appeal of Cartesianism to a man like Arnauld? Well, the enemy of your enemy is your friend. Descartes' dismissal of scholasticism and fresh start in philosophy were bound to appeal to Arnauld. Descartes was somewhat more friendly to the Jesuits than Arnauld was, admittedly a low bar, as we can see from the fact that he tried to win them over to the ideas of the Meditations. But those ideas represented a clean break with scholastic modes of thought, which Arnauld, like his father before him, deeply opposed. A further reason for Arnauld's Cartesian sympathies was that he saw Cartesianism as providing strong arguments for fundamental Christian doctrines, like the existence of God and the separability of the soul from the body. Still, Arnauld didn't agree with Descartes about everything. In addition to raising the Cartesian circle and worries about the method of doubt, there was a potential incompatibility of Cartesian physics with church doctrine. In his objection to the Meditations, and then in a further letter, Arnauld pointed out to Descartes that his theory of matter could render the Eucharistic miracle impossible. If matter is just extension, then how could Christ's body be present in the host without being present locally or in place as the Church instructed? One might think that Descartes would have an easy answer here. Yes, the Eucharist involves something impossible, but that's all right because God can make impossible things happen. It's not clear, though, whether God actually does ever make impossible things happen, according to Descartes. Their Cartesian position is rather that God could do that in some merely theoretical sense, since it is God who decides what is possible and impossible in the first place. Descartes' faithful disciple, Robert Descartes, emphasized this idea, even though Descartes himself had proposed it only rather tentatively. For Descartes, eternal truths, for instance the truth that every body has extension, or that triangles have three sides, are immutable because God has willed them into being, in a way that transcends time and thus change. Arnauld does not seem to have shared this distinctive Cartesian view. We see this from his discussion of the Eucharist, where he assumes that God has no power over what is possible and impossible, and from other passages too, like one where he says that God would not be able to make a void space if Cartesian physics is true. So Arnauld apparently saw logical possibility as a constraint on God's actions. Still, when it comes to human action and moral responsibility, he put great emphasis on divine power. As a Jansenist philosopher, he was bound to think deeply about free will and its relation to divine grace. As we've by now seen innumerable times, anyone who addressed this question had to steer a path between two dangers. If you emphasize human freedom, then divine grace may be unnecessary. But if you emphasize the role of grace, you threaten to make humans into God's puppets rather than freely choosing and responsible agents. Jansen and his followers were obviously flirting with the second of these dangers. The idea of efficacious grace is as stark as it is straightforward. If God does not give you grace, you will definitely remain sinful. If God does give it to you, you cannot fail to be righteous. Grace has its effect necessarily or through itself. By its very nature, it cannot fail, and it needs no contribution from the side of the human to be effective. Rather, it heals the weakness inflicted on humans by original sin. Jansen spoke of the victorious pleasure felt by the recipients of grace, which makes them do with holy love what they already knew they ought to do, but were too weak to carry out. Jansen qualified this by saying that even when we are doomed to act wrongly by sin, or guaranteed to act rightly by grace, we do still retain the power to do the opposite. This proposal goes way back through the Augustinian tradition, for instance to the early medieval thinker Anselm. He offered the following comparison. Someone in a state of sin can be good, but only in the sense that a blindfolded person can see. In such cases, one has a power that one isn't presently able to use. Being an Augustinian traditionalist and defender of Jansen, You would expect Arnauld to follow this line, and at first he did. But in the mid-1680s, after reading a lot of Aquinas, he changed his mind. It's not enough, he now thought, that one could act differently under different circumstances, like the man who could see if someone removed his blindfold. Rather, we need to be able to act differently in the present circumstances if we are to count as free. Sometimes no alternatives are available. No one can stop wishing to be happy, and no one can withhold their assent from clear and distinct ideas, a reminder of Arnauld's Cartesianism. But apart from that, every choice we make is such that we could have chosen differently. This now sounds more Jesuit than Jansenist, but Arnauld too adds an important qualification. Even though it's genuinely possible to choose one action over another, the choice could stem from an overwhelmingly powerful desire. He gives the example of a tyrant who has been offended by one of his subjects. Clearly, the tyrant could just let the insult go, but let's face it, given his personality, he is obviously going to punish the subject mercilessly. Or consider this. Could a perfectly wise sage cut off his own nose for no reason? Yes, he could, but of course he never would. Likewise, we act wrongly because sin gives us an irresistible motivation to do so. And when God gives us grace, we acquire an opposite motivation to act well, which is equally irresistible. That's why efficacious grace is guaranteed to work. Here then we have Arnaud's explanation of why God is not just a puppet master. Puppeteers make Punch and Judy hit each other by pulling their strings, not by instilling in Punch and Judy a furious anger they cannot resist. And unlike puppets, humans feel strongly that they could act differently if they wanted to. It's just that they do very much want to act the way they are acting. Arnauld offers a memorable example to underscore this point. No matter how determined I am not to go naked into the street, I nevertheless have the power to do it, and I would do it if I wanted. How far has Arnauld wandered from Jansen's original position here? Jansen clearly adopted a form of what philosophers would now call compatibilism. This is the view that freedom is compatible with causal determination. Thus, for Jansen, even when some cause makes it necessary for you to act as you do, you can still be free. This is because you still retain a power to act differently, albeit one you cannot presently use. In his later career, Arnauld seems to abandon that idea because he puts so much stress on our genuine ability to act otherwise. This might sound like the modern-day position called libertarianism, which sees determinism as incompatible with freedom. But the examples he gives still seem to be cases where people are determined to act as they do. It's just that what determines them is their own motivations. The sage could theoretically cut his nose off, but his beliefs and desires ensure that he won't. In light of this, I think it would be more accurate to say that Arnauld remained a compatibilist, as we should expect, given his devotion to the Jansenist cause. It's just that he thought our freedom is compatible with causal determination only if the causes in question are our own desires. That's something a lot of modern-day compatibilists would say too, though without all the theological trappings. So, now we've met two versions of Arnauld, the critically minded Cartesian philosopher and the no less critically minded Jansenist theologian. Arnauld was famously disputatious, and criticism is the thread that runs throughout his whole career, as we'll find when we meet two further versions of Arnauld. Alongside the Cartesian circle, his most famous contributions in philosophy were an attack on Malebranche and a critical rethinking of the art of logic. I'll postpone the attack on Malebranche until we've discussed him too, so that both parties to the dispute have been introduced. But we're ready now to tackle Arnauld the logician. This is the Arnauld who produced a bestseller textbook together with his friend Pierre Nicole. As I keep saying, it's very famous, honest, and next time we'll find out why, as we delve into the Port Royal logic, here on The History of Philosophy, without any gaps.